Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. We are continuing our study of the period between June and September 1944 with special guest, retired Lieutenant Colonel Roger Cirillo. Roger is writing a book on this intriguing period, and we'll be talking about Montgomery's strategy. So it's bound to get the conversations going, because as soon as Montgomery comes up on the channel, like MacArthur, like Patton, everybody's got an opinion. I've got opinions. Mine are always shifting, but I'm delighted to have Roger here. I'll bring him in now. Good afternoon, Roger. How are you today?
I'm very fine. How are you?
I'm good. So this has been an intriguing series we've done here. We were just talking before going live. So often we skip straight from, the closing of the Falaise Gap, or even earlier, and we leap straight to September and Market Garden. But actually, there's weeks of really fascinating stuff. There's the Brittany campaign. There's the decision to go for Paris. There's the creation of the first Allied Airborne Army, and all these figures that have suddenly kind of they're off the reins now. Montgomery, Patton, they all have their own ways they want to wage the war. Has it been a really fascinating period to study? Forget the actual drawing and conclusions. Is it an overlooked period? Was it fun to do the research?
Yes, it was, especially the pre-Overlord research, to find out what SHAEF's plan was and how they were going to support it, because that has everything to do with the decisions that are made in August and September.
Yeah, because it's, often people think that there isn't really a broad plan. It's just get into France, hope we get through the first day, and work it out as we get there. But of course, decisions and plans have been made going back months, arguably years. But anyway, we're going down a rabbit hole already. All you got to do, Roger, is tell me when to move on the slides, folks, because Roger's going to be bringing up a lot of themes today. We're going to do the big questions from you guys at the end of the show, because I think a lot of the things you'll ask will be coming up as the presentation goes on. But basically, I'll hand over to Roger to take us through this really fascinating period. So over to you, sir.
Okay, the first slide, please.
Yep, we're up.
The second slide, then. Okay. You have to understand that the late summer 1944, the Allies were really at a crossroads in Northwest Europe. They had already defeated the German army in Normandy, which had held the line for roughly 2 full months. Hitler's intention at this time was to buy time for his V weapons program, which actually began with the first V1 rocket firings in June of 1944. He had hoped to stalemate the Allies in the West. And German success did not conform with what the Allies had theorized would actually happen. And they looked for ways out of their narrow bridgehead as part of their strategy. They did manage a double breakout by the first week of August of 44. And as the campaign developed, the Allies had to adjust both their command and their strategy to what was happening on the ground. This also included a landing in southern France on August 15th. Now, when you look at the summer of 1944, you actually have to remember the whole smorgasbord of plans that went on before. Overlord, which was the Normandy planning, Fortitude, which was the deception plan, the transportation plan, which was the plan to interdict all rail and road into the Normandy area, Operation Anvil, which is the landing in southern France, and then the ongoing combined bomber offensive, which was called Point Blank. Now, when the analysis of the theater by the joint planners was done for what would happen after Overlord, they identified 4 major avenues as consisting of the entranceways or gateways into Germany. The first one would be Flanders up in the north. The second, which was the primary one, was Liège, Aachen, Cologne, which leads into the Ruhr. The third was the Ardennes, which actually separates geographically north and south, the front. And then the southern part, which was Verdun, Metz, Saarbrücken, which led into the Saar. Now, the Ardennes split the theater into about a 40-60 split laterally, which Bradley referred to as the 2 thrust plan, which was one attack north of the Ardennes and one attack south of it. But it was much more complex than that. The basic planning assumptions for the combined chiefs was that it would take 1 year for the war to end. And that was really a politically driven plan, because they realized that after they defeated the Germans, they had to fight the Japanese. And Roosevelt and Churchill thought that their countries could not stand more than a 1 year attack. So this was really kind of a guess, which actually turned out to be pretty accurate. Now, the major planning factor that's never mentioned by the Allies is the assumption that the Red Army would continue to hold the bulk of the German forces in the East. And if this did not happen, the war would have gone completely differently. It's essential to remember that the Germans had about 70% of their combat power at this time facing the East. And this took a tremendous amount of strain off the Allies, because they knew they could not produce a division for division match numbers with the Germans if the Germans massed in the West. Now, I once attended a conference on Barbarossa, which featured 15 German officers who had commanded companies and battalions in Barbarossa literally on the first day of the invasion. And one of the things that one of the German officers mentioned was that Germany considered that they were in a society versus society match against the communists, that there was no way that Germany could coexist with the communists. And this is an important concept to remember when you look at the fighting in the West, because the Germans, in one sense, are fighting with their crippled hand against us, because they have to keep the Russian hordes out of East Germany. And this is the thing that drives most of their thinking. The second thing I think that you have to understand is the relationship of Dragoon, which is the landing in southern France. The British were definitively against it because they recognized that it would draw off forces from the Mediterranean, which they considered the major campaign for fixing forces away from Overlord. Mark Clark and Alexander held about 22 to 25 German divisions consistently on their line that could have been used in Overlord. So Dragoon is very important. Probably the most interesting thing that happens in August of 44 is what historians refer to as victory fever, which is once they broke out, you had people that thought the war was almost over. All you had to do was continue to drive, that the German army didn't exist. And that was simply not true for a large number of reasons. Next slide, please. When you look at the map and you can see late August of 44, you can see why that the Allied generals thought that they were in the winning factor. Now, the thing that you don't see is the fact that the Allied supply lines are now 400 miles long, and that the basic concept for doing Overlord was to capture the Brittany ports, which was how the American army was going to deploy and land. So you had all of these forces driving as fast as they could against the retreating German forces, and in reality, they were operating on fumes. Next slide, please. What's the crux of the problem? Well, the crux of the problem is not only how they planned it, but the reality of how they were going to support it. This sketch comes from May of 1944, before they actually landed, when they were doing the post-Overlord planning. And it shows how they thought the operation would develop. And you could see that by D+40, they were supposed to be already very deep into Brittany and starting to open the ports. Now, there's something that goes along with this time frame. It's not just where the phase lines are going to be. It's whether you have dumped your supplies forward, whether you've created ports for landing troops, whether you have rehabilitated roads and rail and whether you have relayed communications lines, which were probably cut by the Maquis. So all of these things would affect what the things you're able to do. So when you look at the previous map and you see those big lines, you see that they had already surpassed where their capabilities were already planned for. And those capabilities were planned optimistically based on how fast you could load things on the ships and get them to the port. It really wasn't a fine line war game as to where the Germans would actually be. As a matter of fact, the Allied strategy was based on a false assumption, and that assumption was that the Germans would fall back progressively on successive defense lines, which are the major rivers, and that the armies would sort of trundle forward almost like in World War I. And this, of course, was not the case. The Germans defended very well forward in Normandy, and they held us in that enclave for 2 solid months. Next slide. Next slide, please. When you look at the next line, you can see that this is where they thought they would be by D+60, okay, roughly the middle of July. And that shows all of Brittany captured and all the ports being rehabilitated at that time. And by this time, they had expected that Eisenhower's headquarters would have moved from Portsmouth into Normandy and that he would assume command, which of course did not happen. Next slide, please. If you look at the D+70 line or D+270 line, you could see that they are not even expecting to be at the German border. But they will have developed not only the Brittany ports, but the Channel ports. And this is pretty much about where they figured at. The Allies actually reached the D+270 line at approximately D+100. So yay for the team by saying they move faster, but woe to the team because none of their supply lines are in shape at all. Okay, and the Americans are not operating out of Brittany, they're operating out of Le Havre and Cherbourg, which is about 400 miles away. Now, there are 2 magic numbers that you should remember at this time. One is called the division slice. A division slice means the actual strength of the division plus the number of combat service support people to support it. And the magic planning number for the Allies for a division was 40,000 men per division slice, whether it was a British or American division. The other magic number to remember was they planned on having at least 700 tons of supplies per day per division. And those have to be moved along those supply lines and dumped forward. And that, of course, had not happened. When they captured Paris, they also lost 5,000 tons of supply per day in food, which was given to the people of Paris, which would have starved otherwise. So the problem is not really just advancing rapidly. The problem is, how do you deal with this shortfall? And how do you maintain the theater? And of course, the generals are looking at how do you win the war quickly? The one who actually looked at the logistics of it was Montgomery, not Bradley and Patton. All they did was complain that the supply people weren't supplying them. Monty recognized the port issue, and he had an awful lot of experience in moving an army because he had to move an army across 1,400 miles of Africa. And he understood that you could not move everything at the same time if you wanted to move airfields and if you wanted to establish lines of communication. So his plan was based on doing those things. Next slide.
Just a quick question for you, Roger, and I hope it's not going to be too long a question.
Sure.
These projected phase lines, was that determined by kind of committee? Was it a process of averaging out what different people thought in terms of logistics and general?
it was figured out by where the logistics people were unloading their stuff and in time on a planned map.
Right.
And let me get rid of this call. And figuring how long it would take. So they knew what the dumping time was. They knew what the schedule of ships were. They knew how long it took to unload it. And they could compute time, distance, and weight of supplies based on division days in the field.
Okay.
And so that's where it came from. And it was an educated guess. It's not based on a war game. It's really kind of a PERT chart like an engineer would do. And that's where it came from. Now, the strategy comes from the center of gravity theory, which is popular now. And these are the things you look at that the enemy has, which you want to focus on. And that's their economy and and their resources. And it's important at this point to understand that the Germans were short of oil and fuel. A third of their oil came from the Ploesti oil fields, which were destroyed virtually in 13 air raids in July of 1944 by the 15th Air Force, my father's outfit. Okay. And then Ploesti was overrun in August by the Red Army. Most German fuel came from synthetic oil plants. They made fuel synthetically from coal, and they were spread throughout Germany. And at the time of the Normandy breakout was the time when 8th Air Force launched its anti-oil operations. So the 15th and the 8th were hitting all of their oil resources. Industry, of course, was spread not only throughout Germany, but it was spread into the Germans used the industry of every country they captured. So they had a tremendous amount of things being made elsewhere. The bulk of the population of Germany was actually in northern Germany, as was the capital. And of course, you look at the geography to see how you can actually move your army, and that has to do with roads and rivers and mountains. Next slide, please. This is what the map of the Ruhr looks like. And you can see all these little patches are small industrial cities. If you actually calculated what Germany was making, more than 50% of all German products to support either the population or the war was made in that blotch. That was the most heavily bombed territory by the RAF. And it was considered the gold standard for knocking Germany out of the war. The theory was that if you took the Ruhr, even if they held everything else, within 90 days, a German war machine would just end. It just couldn't operate anymore. Next slide.
And that idea of that obsession about the Ruhr, is that kind of British led? Because I do remember reading certain things that Americans don't quite agree.
Well, it's British led because that's where Bomber Harris wanted to depopulate. But the American economists and strategists accepted that because it was just a matter of scientific proof that you could prove where all the stuff came from. So it's, the British initiated it because they were in the war first.
Okay, thanks.
Now, we ought to talk about command. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force and the brood that sits below it are the guys that run it. As you could see, it's an even mix of Americans and Brits. Now, there was an American Supreme Commander who was selected by virtue of the fact that America was going to provide more stuff. That was the simple reason. But the commanders of the Army, Air Force, and Navy were British officers. This did not sit well with most American generals. Okay, the Americans were not big world players before World War I. They figured they were there to win the war, and the British were in the way. It's a generational thing. How people feel now about each other and how we deal with each other has very little relationship to how people thought in the early 1940s. They were much narrower. And you got to remember, the British had an empire at that time. So they thought they were on top of the world. And the Americans thought they were on top of the world because we had all kinds of industry. And this breeds over into how the armies work. And it's also essential to understand that the British Army and the American Army are not the same. They have different weapons, different tactics, different doctrine. The Americans had a lot of new stuff. The British Army was the red-haired stepchild of the British Empire. It had World War I rifles, a Vickers machine gun that was first used against Africans or Zulus or whatever. And their tanks weren't terribly good. They just did not have the money being put into them that the RAF got, or the Navy, which was essential for Britain's survival. So the British Army really couldn't compete in a lot of ways with the American Army.
We got better by the end, but yeah.
yeah, that's right. That's pretty true. So I think the other thing you have to understand is that SHAEF had planned to take over the ground command. They planned it for D+45. And in reality, they didn't actually take over until 1 September of 44. And when they located, they were 400 miles behind the front at Granville. Now, Granville was not selected because it had a great beach view of the channel. It was selected because that's where the undersea cable can be tapped in, so they could talk to London and Washington. So Eisenhower's in really a bad position. His front has moved because it's been successful, but he can't visit the front very easily unless he uses an airplane. And he has very poor communications initially, and this will become a real major factor in how the campaign is carried out. Next slide, please. Now, the available forces for Ike in late August are symbolized by their shoulder patches. And you can see if you go from left to right, you have 21 Army Group, and 21 Army Group is at its peak. From August onward, it would get smaller because it had very few replacements. In August, they inactivated their 1st Division, the 59th, and broke it up and took their equipment and sent their men in all directions. And Britain's army was, as it was officially termed in one planning document, a wasting asset. 12th Army Group, which was Bradley's group, was getting bigger, and it got fatter by the day. It got 4 new divisions a month across the beach, and it already had 30, and it was going to grow to over 60. So it was the heavyweight. 6th Army Group was that odd quilt patch that covered the southern France invasion, and that had U.S. 7th Army, which was small, and the British or the French 1st Army, which had 8 divisions on paper, but the divisions were really brigade sized. They were decent soldiers, but they were not terribly well supported. Then you had 1st Allied Airborne Army, which is a real Walt Disney operation. It should have been a cartoon. And they had this dramatic idea that they could land an army from the sky. And at the time, it had 2 U.S. airborne divisions with 1 more en route, 2 British airborne divisions, 1 air landing division, the Polish Airborne Brigade, and a variety of strange oddities, like airborne engineers and airborne tanks that never flew and things like that. And these guys were supported by the U.S. 9th Tactical Air Force and the British 2nd Tactical Air Force. The strategic air forces at this time were split back off and went under national control.
Yeah.
The U.S., by the way, had a thing called U.S. Strategic Air Forces Europe, which was run out of England, but it also included the 15th Air Force in Italy. And that's so they could synchronize the bombing operations from both Italy and England against Germany, so they could stretch the German defenses. Now, this is a very sizable force. Ike has well over 1 million men in France by the 1st of August. And of course, this is what he's going to have to take command of on the 1st of September. Next slide, please. The first guy I think we should talk towards is Bernard Montgomery, who, as I'm fond of saying, did not suffer from a shortage of confidence. He was a considerably cocky, sure individual who was a very good general even by the several American generals I know that knew him. But he got on people's nerves like immediately. And he also was convinced that he had the sole solution to ending the war. And this becomes a problem. It becomes a problem because Montgomery is very well liked within the British Army by the enlisted men, not the officers.
Yeah.
He is very much the darling of the British press. He has kept Churchill's government in power by delivering successes when everyone else delivered failures. And he's not a guy that you can kind of walk away from. He also is the guy that took over the Overlord plan and made it work. Even Beadle Smith agreed to that. So he did have a considerable amount behind him. And he will come up with a plan to end the war, which Eisenhower, of course, for a number of reasons, will turn down. The second guy we should talk to, next slide, please, is Omar Bradley. Now, Bradley was a very competent general. He had proved that in Tunisia and in Sicily, and he became the first army commander in Normandy. And by default, he becomes the army group commander, being that there's nobody that they can really trust to give an army group to, because the guys that were senior to him had never been in combat. The guys that were junior to him didn't have the experience. Now, Bradley was the darling of the American press, particularly Ernie Pyle. And the invention that Ernie Pyle came up with was that Omar Bradley was the GI general, that everybody loved him. Well, that was not particularly true. It was really Pyle and other people being so revolted at Patton personally, how he acted, particularly after the slapping incident, that America needed a hero, and it was going to be the guy that was a farmer from Missouri. Now, Bradley is also from Missouri, as was John J. Pershing. And you've got to remember that Pershing was famous for fighting off the Allies in World War I. And Bradley feels that he has become the champion of America, that virtually he's super sensitive to any kind of criticism. And whenever he's criticized, he always says it's a slam against America and the American army. And this goes on really through the two books he writes and almost every conversation he has after the war. So you've got to remember that anything that Monty says is going to be antithetical to what Omar wants to do, whether it's logical or not. This becomes a problem, really becomes a problem in the Ardennes, but we're not talking about that today.
Yeah, well, we'll do that in December.
Next slide, please. The basis for the entire post-Overlord strategy is their assessment of the avenues of approach. An avenue of approach is more than just a road. It's really a geographic corridor. And the way you analyze it is you look at what size force you can put on it, how you can support it logistically, how you can support it by air, by putting airfields there, whether you can use airborne troops to seize key points, whether they're river crossing sites. And also the nationality of who goes on that avenue is very important, because you can't put weaklings on the main avenue. Now, by dearth of luck, which had to do with where the British ports were and where we were going to deploy the army from, the Americans end up on the right as you face into Europe and not on the left. And if you look geographically at Europe, the gold standard, the Ruhr, is on the left. The biggest port, Antwerp, is on the left, and all the channel ports are there. And that's where the British forces end up. The Americans end up kind of in the center. And what they get is essentially two major avenues, because we're not going to talk about southern France. So when they looked at these four avenues, the two that you wanted to use, the Liège, Aachen, Cologne corridor and the Metz approach, both are in Omar Bradley's sector. And Monty has the north, but he's closest to the Ruhr, but it doesn't have the easiest access to it. So the avenues of approach, when they decided Eisenhower's solution, which is the Allied solution, is we'll put people on all of them. We won't have any penetrations. We will just have the front go forward, and we will focus on the four avenues. And that's how the broad front plan comes up. So next slide, please. If you look at Eisenhower's strategy, which is called the broad front, it essentially spreads everybody out. And Eisenhower is very fond of saying it disperses the German forces. And Monty is very fond of saying, but it also disperses ours, and we should concentrate. Now, you could argue this forever, but when you look at it on a map, it is not probably the Staff College solution. Okay. Next slide. This comes from Monty's memoir, which is why it says my conception. He believed in keeping the two army groups together, which when he proposed that in mid to late August of 44 was still possible, and taking them from Aachen north, and they would essentially bowl their way through. They would have enough forces to clear the coast and take Antwerp and clear the Ant, and they would have 2.5 armies left to overrun the Ruhr. Now, he made the mistake several times of saying this was the fastest way to Berlin, but what he really wanted was to take out the Ruhr. Berlin was not necessarily a big object except in Churchill's mind. In fact, at SHAEF, they never even planned on going there. They had figured they would take the Ruhr and that the Russians, who were closer, would take Berlin. You'll notice that the diversion from the south is Anvil. SHAEF actually never comes up with a solution for what to do once they got up the valley and got to Strasbourg. It kind of became the lost army group with no real objective, because they were pointed directly at the Black Forest, which of course leads nowhere. So, it was a good idea to disperse people. They had huge ports in the Marseille group. And when Patton starts running out of fuel, Eisenhower will actually start thinking, saying, well, why aren't we supplying him out of Marseille, which is just as close as Cherbourg or Le Havre? And they finally didn't get the ports operating to do that until January of 45. So you could see that this was not really thought of ahead of time. But these are the two competing strategies. Next slide. Why do the Allies think that the war is over? Well, unfortunately, they listened to the G2. The G2 estimated that the Germans had lost 400,000 men in Normandy. Now, considering the Germans never had 400,000 men in Normandy, it was closer to 300,000. It's kind of fixing the numbers. I suppose you could say that guys that were retreating back in the 15th Army would account for the rest, and they considered them cut off. The Germans probably did lose that many tanks, guns, and vehicles, mostly not to being destroyed, but to being abandoned due to lack of fuel. In August of 44, the Germans literally were not being supplied because the air was all over the roads. and their supplies were being run up. So during the retreat, they had to abandon a tremendous amount of stuff. And this, to any general that passes a road full of trucks, looks like the German army is losing. Next slide, please. If you look at the actual overall force ratios of how many Allied divisions in strength versus German divisions, it doesn't come out that good. The Germans had about 50 divisions in the West on paper, but they equated to about 22 divisions. We had about 30 at the time. Now, we had tons of tanks because the Germans had left all of those behind. But we really didn't have that great a superiority in artillery. And the superiority in planes, in a lot of ways, is irrelevant to the ground war, because most of those planes are participating in the strategic air war, either bombing Germany or defending Germany. It really doesn't count what's flying over your head. So when you actually look at force ratios based on the whole front, it's almost a wash in the 1st of September. And that indicates to me that the Germans can eventually bounce back, and that's what they're going to do. Next slide, please. If you look at the plans from early 45, it really shows where the major avenues were. The difference in this plan was that there were going to be 80 divisions in these attacks. And at the time, the Allies really, in the spring of 44, had about 40. But it really shows the importance of the armies north of the Ardennes as to taking out the Ruhr. And the irrelevance of the armies in the south as to having to go the long way to get to either the Ruhr or Berlin. And of course, the two southern prongs are where Patton's army is, coming up from the Saar. Next slide. If you look at this graphic that was used by Omar Bradley to show where the major things were for the spring offensive of 45, it shows pretty much where the important areas are. And the most important, of course, is the Ruhr. And the rest of them are major terrain features, and all the hatchered parts are really obstacles for armor movement. Now, if you're an armor guy, you want to go around those two big blobs in the north. And that was exactly Montgomery's theory, that you surrounded the two and cut them off, and then they would eat themselves into non-existence. If you're an infantryman, you want to stab them all with bayonets. And if you're Eisenhower, you want to eat all the cookies in turn and not maneuver. Just put everybody online so everybody's happy. Every general's a prince, and everybody has his own avenue of approach, and eventually the war will be over. And that's really the crux of the argument, is how you look at it, what you look at the major portions of it. Next slide. It's important to understand what the principals said, which is why I put their words up for you to read. I know that's tedious, but when you have somebody else summarize it, who is either pro or con, you sometimes lose the weight of the logic of the individual that's writing. And that is the message that Monty wrote for de Guingamp to carry to Ike on the 22nd. And that is what they discussed on the 23rd when Monty tries to sell him the plan. And those are the exact words that Monty used. They're very succinct. If you read to the end of it, you will see that there is a poison pill in this plan. And that poison pill is, I'm going to do it.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that Marshall had already ordered Eisenhower in the middle of August to take command on the front, that he was tired of the newspapers. It was an election year. Roosevelt wanted the Americans in charge and the British put away. And they'd already set up the Philippines so MacArthur could return, which was going to be actually to support Roosevelt's election. And now Eisenhower was going to be the victorious chief. So plan be damned, you can't have that guy in charge. Now, Eisenhower could have taken the plan and executed it himself. Not as well, I don't think, because he didn't have the comms. But therein lies the real crux of the plan. That's what he wanted. Single control, concentration. And those are the exact words. I think they've had time to read that. So let's move
they have.
on.
They can always pause it later. Yeah.
Now, Eisenhower, being the senior man at the meeting, sends a letter back summarizing what he agreed to do, just so Monty won't get the wrong feeling on what had happened. Now, he says that Bradley's army group will support him. He doesn't say it will be under his command. And from this point on, there is an argument over how much of First Army is going to be north of the Ardennes and how much is going to be south. Bradley had already released a plan on the 20th of August, which put all of his armies south of the Ardennes and given them crossing points on the Ruhr. But that was never implemented, although it was issued for planning purposes. Now, what Eisenhower is doing is saying that we're going to turn a large portion of the American army to the northeast, so you can go northeast to take Antwerp and move against the Ruhr. So those are the words. And of course, Monty will, interpret them to the way he believes. Next slide. This is what Monty puts in his diary. How many divisions can I get out of Hodges? And these will be directed on the Brussels-Liège area, the right flank of the group. That fits his conception of the Brits taking the area north of the Ruhr, which is from Basel on north, because all the cities are south of Basel. And the Americans coming through the Aachen corridor and approaching from the south. This is the double envelopment. That's what he believes will happen. Next slide. And these, of course, are the culprits. On the left, you see Bradley and Monty, and on the right, you see Courtney Hodges, whose face is covered but wasn't impressive anyway, and Bimbo Dempsey, the Second Army commander. This was taken when Monty was in control in Normandy. Now, they actually meet 3 times in early September to coordinate their plans. But every time Bradley will leave the meeting and then give more shit to Patton to go south. He will hamstrung the First Army the best he can and to get away with. Next slide.
Just a quick question for you, Roger. At this point, end of August, is Montgomery aware that from the point of view of the British and Canadians, everybody's in the field now? There's no new divisions to come in now, maybe the 52nd Lowland Division, I suppose, but everybody is deployed now. There's no one else. And that, that there's going to be a manpower shortage.
Oh, yes, indeed. He was aware of that at Alamein.
Yeah,
the British were already talking about that in 1942 because they looked at their PERT chart and they realized when they were going to run out of 18-year-olds. And in early 1944, Montgomery was briefed by the Adjutant General of the British Army, Sir Ronald Adam, and told that by June, you won't have anybody else.
Yeah.
That we're going to have to start, except the Home Guard, you're going to have to break up divisions. And Dempsey was told that, which influenced his decision for Goodwood.
Because the point I'm making is that clearly, regardless of who's in command and what plan gets put into action, the American troops are going to only get more plentiful, and the British and Canadian are going to get less. It's not going to change now.
That's why SHAEF referred to the British Army as a wasting asset. And the Canadian army was bogus anyway, because half of it was British.
Yeah,
it was
and Polish as well. Yeah.
I mean, so you have to understand that the Canadians had fewer replacements than the Brits.
Yeah.
Most people don't realize that to serve overseas in the Canadian Army, you had to volunteer. You could be drafted but kept in Canada, but not sent to France. And of course, the people that stayed in Canada were called zombies, because they did nothing. And it was really bad. And the Americans were, of course, wasteful in how they fought. They could afford to take heavy casualties. J. Lawton Collins told me that. He said the British could never attack like we did because at the end of the attack, they didn't have anybody to replace anybody. So you had to live the fight another day. So you had to do it differently. And that's why the Brits use so much artillery. Next slide, please.
Good point. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay. So Ike is due to take command on the 1st of September. And now he sends his directive. And the key points of that directive is what the Northern Group will do, which is to operate northwest of the Ardennes, and also that the 1st Allied Airborne Army, for planning purposes, not command, is put under Monty. 1st Allied Airborne Army always operated under SHAEF. The plan was done somewhere else, and when the troops landed on the ground, they became under command of that force. But the Airborne Army itself was a SHAEF preserve, which caused a lot of problems emotionally. What's left out of that directive is that Eisenhower makes a big point that the two army groups' main objectives are the Ruhr and the Saar. And at this point, he still believes that the armies will be able to cross France, cross the Rhine, and seize those two areas before the logistical famine starts, which is like the next day. Okay, next slide. The backbone of the British advance is really the Canadian Army, not as far as advancing goes, as far as supporting it goes. And this is really only one corps at this time. The British or the Canadian 2nd Corps has to take Le Havre, Dieppe, Calais, Boulogne, Dunkirk, and then Antwerp, although Antwerp is actually captured by the British. And they kind of slide off of SHAEF's screen. Everybody knows what they're doing. It's an essential, it's a bitter fight, usually siege for each of those places. They're just not going into Germany. And this, of course, is discussed in all of the plans papers that Monty has, because, he's relying very heavily on the channel ports that are between Calais and Antwerp in order to get into Germany. Next slide, please. Dempsey's 2nd Army is actually south of the Seine on the 29th of August. And he gives 12th Corps and 30 Corps the orders to go forward. And his objective is to take Brussels and then Antwerp. And he puts the armored divisions on line, and everybody lines up behind him, and it's a real show. Next slide. While this is happening, Monty now looks at his army moving very rapidly and realizes that if you don't make a major change now, logistically, it's going to be a real mess if you have to reorganize. So what does he do? Being, the obsessive personality that he is, he knows what's right. He goes back to Ike and say, we have to make a decision. Is it going to be the Saar or is it going to be the Ruhr? You can't do both or we'll run out of gas. And then I think it was correct. I believe that is supportable by evidence. As far if you look at the logistics and the enemy order battle and the terrain, the weather, and everything else. Next slide. Ike, of course, says, well, I agree with your conception. I don't agree with your intentions. You know, this is why Ike became president. I mean, this is very good. And he is sticking to the Saar and the Ruhr. And the Ruhr, of course, is Monty's obsession, and the Saar is Bradley's obsession. And if you look at the economic intelligence, you see that Bradley can't sustain the Saar as being a real objective. It doesn't do that much for Germany. 15% of the economy at the most. And once you get there, you got to leave it to go somewhere else. You know, you got to go north up the Mannheim ditch, and you got to go to Frankfurt up the Hessian corridor. So in a lot of ways, it's just an awfully expensive staging area to fight for. Now, Germany's going to fight for it because it's Germany. Don't ever forget that. They fought for every inch of Germany. It was their homeland. They made us pay. There was no doubt about it. But from a military standpoint, the Saar is nothing compared to the Ruhr. Not at all. Next slide.
Just a quick question or a remark, really, because
Sure.
I will invite you back. I'm doing a Scheldt Estuary fortnight later in the year. Noticing that every mention of Antwerp so far in these memos has not mentioned the Scheldt beyond. It's just mentioned Antwerp. I'm just kind of making that point that because that's a big, huge, discussion point.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. I'll
Okay.
talk about why that's important.
Okay, thanks.
Next slide. Ike's, is that actually the next slide? Yeah, okay. Ike's diary on the 5th, after all of this arguing's going on. This is his private memoir that he's going to use for his memoirs later. And if you read it carefully, you'll notice he immediately blames Monty for being cautious. And Ike was the one that invented the Monty is cautious theory. He started that in 1943 because he couldn't understand why it took the 8th Army so long to cross the northern African coast. And he never recognized how the logistics was run and how complicated a problem that was. He just said, well, there's no Germans in front of him. Why isn't he doing 1,000 miles an hour? And Eisenhower is a very visual guy. He looks at maps and he wants to see things move lots of inches. And that's not always realistic in a war. And but that's the way he was. And this is, of course, how he sums it up. And he notices that he says it's necessary for me to get Patton moving again. And the question is where? To the Saar? What does that actually do for you? See? So this is just more evidence that the two men's minds were totally at opposite ends. Next. Now, it's important, I think, to note that Dempsey's army moves 260 miles in 6 days.
Yep.
That's faster than Patton moved.
It's faster than Blitzkrieg in 1940.
Yeah. It's as fast. It's almost as fast as Genghis Khan moved. Okay. And that's about as fast as you can go without a spaceship. And he took Brussels and he took Antwerp. Now, the problem was he didn't clear the Scheldt Estuary. Now, the Navy had warned Monty the day before that you needed to do that. But whether that message was actually passed to anybody, I don't know. But you have to consider one major thing. Monty is never reliant on Antwerp to go into the Ruhr. He figures that Calais and Boulogne are going to carry his army. Antwerp is only important to the Americans because they don't have a major port. And all they really have is Cherbourg and Le Havre, which, by the way, Carrara had to capture. So they temporarily shelve Antwerp. Brian Horrocks goes into Antwerp with 30 Corps and stops. And he's waiting for orders. And he had 100 miles of gas left. He could have gone to Rotterdam, or he could have gone all the way across the Scheldt estuary and closed it off. Neither he nor Pip Roberts, the division commander, really studied the map. They were operating on a road map, not a topographic map at that time, because they'd run out of the maps. The maps weren't actually issued until a day or two later, the topographic ones. So you can see that success all of a sudden is, what do we do next? You also have to remember that at the exact time this happens, they canceled Limit, which was supposed to be the airborne operation to clear the Calais area. So now they were looking around to, well, okay, if the Canadians are driving through Calais because the Germans are running, what are we going to do? And the immediate thing was cross the Rhine. So they looked, and the staff selection was, let's cross north of Basel, because and it's shorter. For a variety of reasons, that isn't going to happen. And the first reason is that when they planned Comet, which was the airborne operation to support it, the Allied Airborne Army took one look at the Ruhr and shook their heads and said, we're not going to do that. Too much flak. We're going to get slaughtered, in these transport aircraft. So the bridge across the Niederrhein becomes the Arnhem Bridge. So that becomes the focus of how to get to the Ruhr, the Arnhem Bridge, and across all of the waterways of Holland. Now, if you remember back to 1940, you could see when the Germans crossed Holland laterally, some of those same bridges were taken by the airborne. It is not an accident that Monty thinks of using the airborne to do that. He was the first British Army commander to plan, train, and use airborne forces in the United Kingdom in 1942. And what did they plan to do? Bridge seizures. He does 2 bridge seizures in Sicily, on the way up the west side of, or the east side of the Sicily Island. So you could see that this is a logical progression for where he's been. Next slide.
Although, in fairness, both of those bridge seizures in Sicily were fraught with problems. Neither went perfectly, but that's another discussion of the day.
Nothing goes perfectly.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
Now, at this virtually the same time, Bradley issues another cross the Rhine order. And this is only the First Army part of it. But what you see is that First Army is spread over a front of about 70 miles. And ideally, you would think that at least 2, if not all 3 of those corps would be going north and south of the Aachen corridor to go towards the Ruhr. And they're not. They're evened out so they can be supportive of Patton, who's to the right of the map. So you could see that he's not thinking of the exact same operation that Monty has been trying to sell. Next slide. Well, they go on until, Comet is planned, and it's important to understand one thing about Comet. That if you were going to go to the Arnhem Bridge by taking bridges en route, the big fear was that the Germans would blow all the bridges. So what Second Army was supposed to do was to creep up to Eindhoven slowly and wait, And when the Airborne was dropped on the Grave, Vagel, and Arnhem bridges and Comet, that then 30 Corps would run right up the road and link with them. And of course, this doesn't happen. The front congeals. The Germans start producing forces from nowhere, and we will talk about how that happened after this. So they never went to Eindhoven. So on the 10th of September, which was a Sunday, early that morning, Monty meets with Browning and Dempsey and essentially agrees that we will do a bigger airborne operation. We will use all the lift we can use, which is 3+ divisions, and we will take all the bridges north of Eindhoven, form what they in the plan actually call a stair carpet, and Horrocks will run up it. Now, this was termed Plan 16, is what the original draft says, because it's the 16th plan that Browning does. The next day, it's named Market. That night, that afternoon, Monty meets with Eisenhower. They have the same argument over priority. Eisenhower doesn't give an inch. To the best of my knowledge, although Market Garden might have been mentioned, it was not approved or asked for by Eisenhower because essentially Montgomery had the authority to do it. He'd already been given the planning authority, and Ike was urging him to use the Airborne for political purposes because Marshall wanted the Airborne dropped. If they were going to drop them in the ocean, they were going to drop them before winter came. So they were ready to do that. And then everybody goes back and they form Market Garden, which is the ground and airplane. Next slide. If you look at Monty's concept, which goes down in the official, this is the map from the official history. It's called the Arnhem Plan, and you could see it does a number of things. First, it bypasses the Siegfried line by going up, the Siegfried line stops at Kleve. There's no fortifications after that on the road. The Reichswald Forest, but that's in Germany. The second thing is that it goes all the way to the Zuider Zee. In Comet, they were going to take the Arnhem Bridge and make a small bridgehead and then go straight east into Germany. This recognizes a number of things. It recognizes, first off, that the Germans are now firing V2 missiles from near Rotterdam. And Monty is asked on the 9th by the vice chief of the Imperial General Staff, when can you take those? London can't take this anymore. The other thing is that Antwerp is now becoming a big problem.
Yep.
Everybody wants it. And Monty agrees with that. He does not disagree with that. But his problem is his Carrara can only do so much in tandem. And also that the 15th Army is moved into the Channel ports or north of the Scheldt estuary. This plan solves all of those problems. Now, it was understood, if you read the staff papers at the Army Group headquarters, that once they got to the Zuider Zee, that they were going to turn and clear everything behind them. They were going to clear Holland. They were going to clear Antwerp. They were going to take Rotterdam. They were going to knock out the V2. But then they were going to move their army to bypass the Ruhr and take it from the north. Monty desperately wanted a bridgehead on the Rhine before the winter because he didn't want floods and he didn't want ice. And he said that a number of times. And this, of course, is the mindset that he has when this goes. And the second mindset that supports this is that the German army is teetering.
Yeah.
Even though it's not at this point, that is really hard to disabuse in people's minds. So this is how the plan starts. Next slide. I'm not going to go through Market Garden because you have a whole week full of that, but I will mention a couple of parts of it. That because logistics is so bad, Dempsey is not able to move 8th Corps up until actually the 17th. And they don't actually get to their river position till the 18th. So when Garden starts, which is an hour and a half after Market is dropped, there aren't 3 divisions on line. There's only the 1 division on the road. And 12th Corps and 8th Corps, which were supposed to protect the flanks at 30 Corps for at least 2/3 of the way, don't really start until the 19th. But they're in a hurry to drop these guys for a number of reasons. One is weather, but the other is they're realizing that they're going with 3 divisions because there's more Germans. Every day there will be more Germans, so they drop them as soon as they can. So they drop them. And what happens on the road, of course, is a series of what Jimmy Gavin referred to me as self-adjusting foul-ups. The first of which was, the Caen Bridge got blown up. Well, they were supposed to be in Eindhoven the first night, and they didn't get that far because they ran into an armored group that just appeared recently. And the second day, they end up fighting their way through Eindhoven and then north. And when they get to the Caen Bridge, of course, it's in 2 pieces. It was rebuilt overnight. And Guards Armored gets on the road the morning of the 19th. And they drive 37 miles between 6 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock in the morning. And they get to the Grave Bridge. And they're now in 82nd land. Now, the 82nd has not taken the Nijmegen Bridge for a number of reasons, primary of which is they were told not to. They were told to hold the Groesbeek Ridge. If you go there and you're familiar with Holland, which is mostly below sea level, you look at the 300-foot high Groesbeek Ridge and you say, I'm here in the Dutch Alps. I mean, this is the biggest thing I've ever seen in Holland, okay? If the Germans, who were only the Reichswald Forest is only a couple of miles away, had taken the Groesbeek Ridge, they would have dominated both the Grave Bridge and the Nijmegen Bridge with artillery fire, and Garden would have come to an end. So Browning was insistent that Gavin take that. Now, they immediately try to put a rush job into taking the Nijmegen Bridge using some of Guards Armored's tanks and a battalion of paratroopers, and it fails. It just fails. There's a ton of Germans in Nijmegen. So the next day, they decide they're going to do a double attack, one across the river and one across the bridge at the same time. They have no boats, and they have to wait for boats, and that's all in the movie, if you've seen Bridge Too Far. The upshot is they don't actually cross the Nijmegen Bridge until about 7 o'clock the night of the 20th. That's almost dark. And now you have an armored division that's strung out on the road. And it's on a high embankment, and there's Germans all around it. No armor guy in the world would have driven down that road at 7 o'clock at night. The next morning, the Germans have 88s and tanks and Elst, and that road's closed. Now, a number of things happen at the same time. There was a battalion that had made it to the Arnhem Bridge, Frost's battalion, and they go under. They're overrun the morning, I think, of the 20th. The rest of the division is now pocketed around Oosterbeek, so the 1st Division is trapped. The 82nd's in pretty good shape, and the 101st is in pretty good shape. But what starts to happen at this time is the Germans start to attack all along what's known as Club Route, which was the 30 Corps road. Next slide, please. So what you start seeing is a battle that starts happening in time and space in different places. And if you're a paratrooper standing at Nijmegen Bridge, you're saying, why aren't the blankety blank British going up the road to rescue their guys? If you are the Corps commander, you're saying, they are cutting all across my entire line. If you look at this vertical line as a lateral line and pretend that north and south or east and west, it looks like a major battle on the ground that goes on in different places. That's exactly what 30 Corps had to deal with. The Germans are coming in from both flanks. The German Panzer element that was in Deelen has moved into Arnhem, and they are pressing against the paratroopers, and they hold the bridge. There are people coming out of the road from Kleve and the Reichswald Force that are pressing against Gavin's guys. The 101st is fighting in all directions, being helped, by the way, by the 8th Corps and at least one regiment of British tanks that's assigned to them. So there is a tremendous battle going on. And while this battle's going on, Horrocks is trying to filter the 43rd Infantry Division north of the river to get to where the British bridgehead is, which is now at Oosterbeek. It's not at Arnhem. And this is the problem. And this problem will be a series of goat ropes and brave actions and disasters for 2 more days. Next slide. Meanwhile, Ike, 400 miles away, is holding a meeting to decide what's going to happen for the rest of the European theater. And of course, he expects Monty to be there. And Monty's got problems. You know, he's got Arnhem going on. He's got Antwerp going on. He may lose a division. He's not in the mood. So he sends, Freddie to Gagnon to go there. And Ike sends this message and says, I will meet the requirements of the Ruhr battle. Well, actually, he doesn't. I insist that all other troops be in to support the main drive. I insist upon the importance of Antwerp. Now, when you look at this is all contradictory.
Yeah.
But Monty believes that he's been given all the support that he needs. And you'll see how long that lasts. But that's what goes on. This is what's precedent. And Monty wants to go to the bridge, and he's told not to. One of his LNOs is actually at the bridge watching the capture of the bridge. And he knows what's going on. Phantom has been sending back messages consistently, not consistently, intermittently, from Oosterbeek. So 1st Airborne is now out of total communications. They know what's going on in Oosterbeek. They know those guys are going to be overrun because they're almost out of ammunition. Next slide. So what happens is the Brits put a battalion of the Dorsets across on the night of the 24th to reinforce these guys. And they realize that they're not going to be able to do a major crossing because the Germans hold the other piece of high ground in Holland, Westerburing Heights, which has a cafe on it. It's a nice place to go.
Yep, lovely.
So they realize that the Airborne can't hold out for a day or 2, which is what they'll need to bring up bridging and everything else. So they order them out. And they bring them out the night of the 25th, and they get out, maybe 2,400 guys out of 9,000. And it's a disaster. There's no doubt about it. I talked to Shan Hackett about it at length. It was a disaster. But that's what happened. Now, the question that really should go through everybody's mind that I have not answered to this point is, where did all of these Germans come from? Well, there was intelligence on it, and the intelligence was fairly accurate. If you look in Dempsey's diary, this is what Dempsey writes when they create Market Garden. In view of the increasing strength on the Second Army front, well, he's talking about the SS Panzer Kampfgruppe that's in front of him at Neerpelt. That's 9th SS. That's the remnants of it. Now, if you read Nicholas Zetterling's book, Normandy 1944, it will show you how many German troops and what equipment escaped from Normandy. If you look at the order of battle books created by a guy by the name of Dugdale, he's using the German record, cites the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions as both having approximately 7,000 men left each out of 18,000. And one of the divisions having 24 tanks and the other one not having any at all. Now, go back to what my mention of how the Germans are rebuilding their divisions. The Germans took the Panzer divisions, all of whom had men escape, most of the division base, which is the combat service support people, and a small part of the combat fighting force, the infantry and the tankers, get out of France. And those guys are re-equipped with Panzers, either Mark IVs from training or Panther tanks, and they're created into battalion and brigade sized units. And that's where these armored divisions come from. And they're not really armored divisions. So when they say that, oh, they knew there were Panzer divisions there, well, they didn't. They knew there was something there. They didn't know the strength. Next slide, please. This is SHAEF's map from the day before. And it shows 9th and 10th SS located essentially along Club Route. They didn't know where it was. And that's pretty accurate. But those are really Kampfgruppe. They are not Panzer divisions.
Yeah.
Now you have to go back and look at the airborne operation in Overlord. The Americans found out on the 27th of May, 1944, that the 91st Air Landing Division was right next to where the 82nd Airborne was supposed to land. But they decided to drop those guys anyway because they needed them to do that mission. They took the risk. They also knew that the 21st Panzer Division was an hour's drive from the 6th British Airborne Division that was going to drop right after midnight on D-Day. They knew that division was there, but they took the risk because they needed those guys to do that. So where is the problem? Is the problem in Market Garden the Germans that are there, or is the problem the plan? Well, you have to ask one codicil before you can answer that question. And that is, how fast does the German army react to a tactical situation? This is 1944. They've been fighting since 39. They know exactly what to do. They have fought in the East. They have more combat experience in the defense than any army in the world, if you count World War I and World War II. They know exactly what to do. They do not fool around. So they react immediately when you act. One other thing that Shan Hackett said to me, he said, you know, young man, you have never fought an army till you have fought the Germans. Mm. I have fought other people. They are remarkable. He said, you can get 10 guys from 10 different units and put them together in a squad. And within an hour, you think they were raised as children together. They really are organized and disciplined and know how to fight. And that was a Brit general that was at Arnhem that told me that. So consider that. So the second question is it the plan? Well, it is the plan. if you look at the major bridges, at no point do they actually drop the Airborne near a bridge. The 101 lost its bridge. It took 3 hours to march 4 miles to the bridge, and they blew it up in their face. The 82nd only took Grave because they dropped it, forces by the bridge, which was not according to the plan. Tucker just convinced the air guys to do that. They were nowhere near the Nijmegen Bridge, and they were nowhere near the Arnhem Bridge. And why was that? There was flak all around it. If you look at the flak maps, the air guys refused. What the logical solution would have been to drop a brigade at the Nijmegen Bridge and the Arnhem Bridge. Now, how do you do that with flak? Well, Brereton knows. They could have saturation bombed the area around both places with fragmentation bombs, just like they did in Cobra. Nobody came up with that plan. Why? Because 1st Airborne didn't talk to anybody. It's just remarkable. The troop carrier commander is a truck driver. His job in life is to bring stuff. It's not to fight. He's not going to volunteer to commit suicide. So the Airborne guys essentially are forced to take the plan as best they could. And I think that people were aware that there were problems. There were no tanks on any drop zones that I know of. Yeah, there were aerial photographs that showed vehicles, but in Germany, you're going to see vehicles anyway. It's a rear area. Stuff's going to be around there. They took a big risk. And what happened is it turned out to be wrong. Monty says in his book, Normandy to the Baltic, that he made 2 mistakes. He said that he didn't force them to drop a parachute brigade on each of the major bridges. And that secondly, he underrated the size of the German forces that were there, which he said he knew were there. But nobody could tell him exactly where they were precisely and how much strength they had. And that was the read upon which he made his decision. And that, of course, turns out to be dangerous. But that's war. Next slide. To go back to it, when you think about Market Garden, the Airborne plan is sexy. The battle for the road is what causes all the problems. It really causes all the problems because even though they didn't get to the bridge, well, Frost was still there. If they didn't have all those guys come out of the Reichswald forest or actually raft across the Rhine River and then move laterally from east to west, they never would have trapped the road above Nijmegen. And south of Vagel, it's the lack of the 2 British flank corps that caused all this to happen. This is what happens when you conduct an airborne operation, which is high risk, high adventure, and it could turn into a horror show. And that's what happened. And it was, by the way, just another operation of war. There were lots of operations like this in the Second World War, some of which worked and some of which don't. Next slide. They did get a significant penetration, and that penetration, although it's been called the bridge to nowhere, is not true. It really becomes a jumping off point to clear the south bank of the Rhine River in I forget the operation's name. The Canadians do it towards Clava and Kalkar and all those other places. And of course, they do varsity at Wesel. Next slide. The Scheldt. The Scheldt was a problem. It was bad terrain, bad weather, and a lot of nasty Germans. And the Canadians died by inches, and it took a long time to clear it. Now, the Americans were mad because The British didn't do it immediately after Market. You have to understand that Montgomery is now fighting to keep the penetration. Okay, he's got Holland that's on fire all around this penetration that he had going to the army. So the three British corps are tied up. The Canadian army is tied up finishing off Calais and Boulogne. And then, of course, they wait to bring up 250,000 rounds of artillery because Courard left and Simmons was in charge and he was going to bomb his way through that. There was an attempt, or at least a plan, to try and use Airborne around there. But again, this was a problem of there was no suitable drop zone that wasn't surrounded by anti-aircraft guns. The Germans had guns all over the coast, and anywhere you put aircraft over there, you'd better be in a fighter plane that should shoot back. You could not survive in a transport. So it takes a good deal of time, and then of course they had to clear the mines out of it. So Antwerp doesn't open till 28 November. Would I blame this on Monty? I would blame it on Ike first. Ike kept saying, cross the Rhine, take the Ruhr, take the Saar. There's nobody in front of you. And he led that cheer right up till the middle of September. Now, Monty would say, if you had accepted my plan in August, none of this would have happened because I would have had a full army up there and we could have done it with the full Canadian. And that's half true. That's acceptable, but who knows? Looking at it backwards, you could see problems. Looking at it forwards, you see risks. And commanders take risks. That's the nature of war. And this risk turned out to be, did they ever really run out of gas? No. They always had enough to fight if they were attacked. They had advanced a lot faster than they had planned on. The supply guys did not let them down, as said by Patton and Bradley. The supply guys did more than you would believe that they could do. The soldiers fought very well in both the British and Canadian armies. The Germans, they fought extremely well. And you have to factor those conditions in. And I think that the factor of all of those decisions are they took risks trying to end the war quickly.
Yeah.
And for the British, who had been in the war a long, long time and who were running out of men, they wanted to be part of the victory. And that's understandable. So I think I have another slide.
One more map, and then a photo of Monty and
that's where they end up. And in December, this is the day before the Ardennes. The non-existent German army, of course, comes out of the Ardennes with a vengeance. But you'll notice if you look at that line, nowhere is anybody near, except the French in the south, the Rhine River.
Yeah.
The only ones that could have crossed the Rhine River in 1944 was either 7th Army or French First Army, not the Americans at all, First, Third, or Ninth, or the Canadians or the British. So this is where it goes, and I think that was a long way around, but that's the great argument for strategy. And does it end? No. It goes on, but it goes on in a different way. It goes on, and the strategy that now argued is we should weight the effort to the north, not just only do the north. So it is a significant difference. And the command issue will never quite go away, based on both the personalities and the nature of SHAEF. And that's basically it. So I'd be happy to answer any question. Oh, this is the last picture. Eisenhower was then president. Monty was about to retire from the British Army, and he visited Ike, and Ike took him to his farm at Gettysburg and took him around the battlefield. And of course, Monty told Ike exactly how the battle should have been fought.
Yeah,
Often
classic
wondered,
Monty.
but I was often wondered what was going through Ike's mind when Monty put his face in front of the cannon.
Yeah, yeah. Well, basically, we would be here all night if we did all the questions. So what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to invite you back to on a separate occasion just to answer questions. But a couple of ones I want to address now. My first is, we always talk about Eisenhower's brilliance as a diplomat, just keeping all those egos in check. Did that mean that sometimes, because of his kind of diplomatic way, his orders weren't always crystal clear? It was coming up in the sidebar a lot. A lot of those messages and memos, they were kind of open to interpretation, depending on what you want to read it. Was that a failing of Ike's?
He was not blunt, which was the way the British Army is blunt. Yeah. British generals are generally very blunt. You can never accuse a British general of being vague on what he wants. And I think you're correct there. And I think that also underlying it is the fact that Eisenhower tried to make the Allied team a harmonized team.
Yeah.
And that led to problems.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll do a couple of questions, then we will invite you back. So first, people just being very complimentary. Gregory Fontenot, who wrote a fantastic book about the 1st Division, was on the channel fairly recently. It is he's saying one, actually his other comment about you was earlier on. I can't find that now. He said something about how brilliant you are.
I know, Greg.
But I like that comment that it's useful to recall that both Monty and Bradley liked a narrow front as long as they controlled it. That's
see, neither of them were a narrow front. I mean, Monty's plan was about 125 miles wide with 5,000 tanks, and Bradley's was about 200 miles wide. So I think it would be the single thrust or double
thrust rather than narrow.
Yeah. I think the idea of narrow is that's why I use the word concentrated.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let me look at some other comments we had there, but we'll do it. We'll bring you back in the future. What the ones I wanted to ask? David K is asking, was Roger able to speak with Wehrmacht officers during your time in Europe?
Yes, I did. I spoke to one who was Gerd Niepold, who actually was one of the 2 officers that drew up the original Barbarossa plan, and who later ended up as a briefing officer for Hitler from 40 to 43, and then G3 of the 7th Panzer Division in the East from 43 to 45. He had been retired as a Bundeswehr Corps commander, and I talked to him at length. And I talked to a number of lower-ranking German generals, one of whom was the Chief of Staff at 12th SS Panzer, Meyer, not Panzer Meyer, the other Meyer.
Yep, the other one, yeah.
But I was fortunate in the 80s to talk to Hackett and Gavin, John Norton, who's the G3. I had corresponded with Harry Broadhurst and Sir Charles Richardson, who's the plans officer. And I talked to J. Lawton Collins at length. And I also was able to find before it changed.
Yeah, your internet cut out for a second there, which is that's okay. Yeah, are you happy to come back and do questions another time, Roger? Because I think that's the best.
Well, I apologize for talking too long.
No. It's absolutely. People are saying it's the best one we've done for ages. It's just I think if we start questions now, we'll be here for ages. So we'll invite you back and we'll do a question and answer. I think that's the best thing. There are so many questions that have come up about the Scheldt, about alternative plans for Market Garden. It's fantastic, but there's just too many to do today. So we will bring things to an end. But yeah, we'll bring you back, basically. It's been absolutely delightful listening to you, Roger. And did you enjoy it?
Okay. Yes, indeed.
Brilliant stuff. So, folks, I'll be back in after weekend. Click like and subscribe. And thanks for your fantastic comments. We will get them in a separate show in the future. Thanks, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying, have a good weekend, everybody. Cheers. Bye.